June 26, 1944. The air at Hollandia Air Base in Dutch New Guinea was a physical weight, a stifling, oppressive blanket of tropical humidity that seemed to drain the energy from every man on the field. Inside a crude, makeshift recreation hall, the environment was no better. The structure was a desperate assembly of rough timber and mesh screens, designed more to keep out the swarms of jungle insects than to provide any real comfort. The only sound in the sweltering room was the rhythmic, hollow click-clack of wooden checkers pieces moving across a board. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald, the 29-year-old commanding officer of the 475th Fighter Group, was engrossed in a quiet battle of wits. MacDonald was already a legend in the theater, a 10-victory ace who led one of the most lethal outfits in the Pacific, the Satan's Angels. His opponent was his operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, and for a moment, the high-stakes war outside, the dogfights, the Japanese Zeros, and the grinding campaign for the islands, was eclipsed by the simple geometry of the checkers board. Suddenly, the light shifted. A long shadow stretched across the dirt floor, falling directly over the board and breaking MacDonald's concentration. Standing at the screen door was a man who looked remarkably out of place. He was civilian-clothed, middle-aged, and possessed a quiet, unassuming confidence that didn't quite match the chaotic energy of a forward airbase. The stranger introduced himself in a low, steady voice. At first, the name didn't fully register. MacDonald was a man of action, focused on the survival of his pilots and the logistics of the next strike. He didn't have time for civilian visitors or visiting dignitaries. He looked back down at the game. But the visitor repeated his name, and this time the words seemed to hang in the humid air like a physical presence. Charles Lindbergh. The room went deathly silent. The checkers game was instantly forgotten. The man standing at the threshold of that jungle hut was not just another consultant. He was Lucky Lindy, the most famous aviator in human history. This was the man who 17 years earlier had captured the world's imagination by conquering the Atlantic Ocean alone in a single-engine monoplane. He was a global icon, a pioneer of the golden age of flight. And yet here he was, thousands of miles from the comforts of America, standing in a remote mud-caked outpost in New Guinea. Lindbergh wasn't there for a morale-boosting handshake or a press opportunity. In fact, his presence was technically a secret from the highest levels of the American government. He had come with a specific technical request. He wanted permission to observe and discuss P-38 combat operations. What MacDonald and the pilots of Satan's Angels couldn't have possibly realized in that moment was that this 42-year-old civilian was about to do more for the Pacific Air War than 1,000 new bombers. He was carrying a secret weapon that didn't involve explosives or radar. Within the next 6 weeks, Lindbergh would embark on a series of missions that would shatter the existing flight manuals. By applying the same fanatical obsession with fuel efficiency that had carried him across the Atlantic, he was about to revolutionize long-range fighter operations. He would teach these young aces how to stretch the combat radius of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning by nearly 400 miles. In the brutal theater of the Pacific, where distance was as much of an enemy as the Japanese, Lindbergh was about to turn what pilots considered suicidal long-range missions into standard operating procedure. The impossible was about to become routine, and the teacher was a man the President of the United States had forbidden from ever wearing a uniform again. To the public of the 1920s and 30s, Charles Lindbergh was Lucky Lindy, a daring adventurer who relied on nerves of steel and a guardian angel to traverse the trackless oceans. But to those in the inner circles of aviation engineering, the truth was far more clinical. The secret to Lindbergh's legendary status wasn't just courage. It was a fanatical, almost religious devotion to mathematics and mechanical efficiency. He didn't just fly planes, he solved them like complex equations. The flying gas tank. The origin of this mastery can be traced back to a rainy morning in May 1927 at Roosevelt Field. When Lindbergh climbed into the cockpit of the Spirit of St. Louis, he wasn't sitting in a traditional aircraft. He was strapped into a flying gas tank. To make the 3,600-mile journey from New York to Paris possible, the Ryan NYP monoplane had been radically modified. The aircraft carried a staggering 450 gallons of gasoline, weighing over 2,700 pounds, more than half the plane's total takeoff weight. The main fuel tank was so massive it was placed directly in front of the pilot for safety and balance, completely blocking his forward vision. Lindbergh had to fly using a periscope and side windows, a sacrifice he willingly made to ensure every possible ounce of weight was dedicated to fuel. For 33.5 hours, Lindbergh endured a grueling test of endurance, navigating by dead reckoning over a featureless Atlantic. But while his body fought sleep, his mind was focused on the engine. He knew that the Wright Whirlwind J5 radial engine had a theoretical limit, but he suspected that the official fuel consumption figures provided by the manufacturer were far too conservative. By meticulously adjusting his throttle and mixture controls to the absolute leanest settings possible without stalling the engine, he was performing real-time laboratory experiments in the middle of a storm-tossed ocean. The 85-gallon miracle. When the Spirit of St. Louis finally touched down at Le Bourget Field in Paris, the world went mad with joy. But for the engineers who inspected the plane afterward, the most shocking discovery was hidden inside the tanks. Despite the 3,600-mile journey, Lindbergh landed with 85 gallons of fuel remaining. This wasn't just a safety margin, it was a mathematical impossibility according to the standards of the day. He had achieved a level of fuel economy that the Wright Aeronautical Corporation's own experts had deemed physically unreachable for their engine. Lindbergh had proven that by treating an engine not just as a static machine, but as a variable system that could be tuned in flight, the impossible range could be extended by nearly 20%. Refining the optimal operating envelope. Throughout the 1930s, Lindbergh transitioned from a record breaker to a world-class technical advisor. Working alongside Juan Trippe at Pan American Airways, he pioneered the survey routes that would open the Pacific and Atlantic to commercial flight. During these long, monotonous hours over the water in massive clipper flying boats, Lindbergh turned his cockpit into a classroom. He refined the concept of the optimal operating envelope, the precise intersection where three critical variables reached a state of perfect harmony: manifold pressure, the pressure of the fuel-air mixture entering the cylinders; propeller RPM, the speed at which the engine was cycling; fuel mixture, the ratio of gasoline to air. Lindbergh discovered that by running lean, reducing the fuel flow to the absolute minimum required to sustain combustion, and compensating with specific pressure settings, he was performing real-time laboratory experiments in the middle of a storm-tossed ocean. By the time he arrived at that screen door in New Guinea in 1944, Lindbergh wasn't just a pilot, he was a human computer. He possessed a specialized mastery of the physics of flight that surpassed the official training manuals of the U.S. Army Air Forces. While the young pilots of the 475th were taught to fly by standard procedures designed for safety and simplicity, Lindbergh arrived knowing that those very procedures were holding back the true potential of the P-38 Lightning. He knew more about stretching a gallon of high-octane gas than perhaps any man alive, and he was about to prove it in the most dangerous laboratory on Earth. By 1944, Charles Lindbergh was perhaps the most polarizing figure in America. Despite his unparalleled brilliance as an aviator, he had become a man without a country, a hero whose reputation had been dismantled by the very nation that once worshipped him. The transition from global icon to political pariah was swift and brutal, fueled by his pre-war stance as a leading voice for the America First Committee. Lindbergh had traveled extensively through Nazi Germany in the late 1930s, receiving a medal from Hermann Göring and returning with a terrifying assessment of the Luftwaffe's superiority. His public warnings against American involvement in a suicidal European war, coupled with rhetoric that many perceived as sympathetic to the Axis, earned him the undying enmity of the White House. The Roosevelt feud. The conflict became personal. President Franklin D. Roosevelt viewed Lindbergh not just as a dissenter, but as a dangerous defeatist. In April 1941, Roosevelt publicly compared Lindbergh to the Copperheads, the Civil War-era sympathizers who had sought a negotiated peace with the Confederacy. Outraged by the accusation of disloyalty, Lindbergh resigned his commission as a colonel in the Army Air Corps Reserve. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Lindbergh immediately attempted to return to service, setting aside his isolationism to support the war effort. But Roosevelt's memory was long. The president personally ensured that the doors to the military remained locked, famously declaring that the colonel would never wear an American uniform again. The expertise of a civilian. But while the government could strip him of his rank, they could not strip him of his genius. Expertise, especially in the desperate early years of total war, has a way of finding the front lines. Unable to serve as an officer, Lindbergh transitioned into the role of a civilian technical consultant for aircraft manufacturers. He became a ghost in the machine, moving through the industrial titans of the American war effort. United Aircraft Corporation. He worked extensively with the Chance Vought division, refining the F-4U Corsair. He taught pilots how to safely take off with bomb loads that exceeded the plane's rated capacity, a feat of engineering intuition that saved lives and increased strike power. Ford's Willow Run plant. He spent months troubleshooting the nightmarish production problems of the B-24 Liberator, the flying boxcar that was vital to the strategic bombing campaign. The P-47 Thunderbolt. Lindbergh engaged in high-risk, high-altitude test flights to analyze engine performance under extreme stress, often flying at the very edge of the aircraft's envelope. A clandestine deployment. Despite these contributions, Lindbergh was unsatisfied. He was a man of action, and he hungered for the real thing, combat. By early 1944, he saw a narrow window of opportunity. United Aircraft wanted to study the performance of twin-engine fighters in the Pacific, and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning was the only American aircraft that fit the bill. Under the guise of a technical representative sent to observe combat conditions, Lindbergh secured authorization for a trip to the South Pacific. The deployment was a masterpiece of bureaucratic maneuvering. It was authorized by the Navy Department, but kept strictly secret from the White House. On April 3, 1944, Lindbergh prepared for his departure with the meticulousness of a man going to his own execution or his own rebirth. He visited Brooks Brothers in New York to purchase a naval officer's uniform, but notably, it bore no insignia of rank. At a local bookstore, he purchased a small New Testament, writing in his journal that as he could only carry one book into the war zone, that would be his choice. When he boarded the transport for the Pacific, neither President Roosevelt nor the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, knew that the man they had banned from the military was headed straight into the teeth of the most brutal aerial campaign in history. Lindbergh wasn't just going to observe, he was going to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. When Charles Lindbergh finally arrived in the South Pacific in the spring of 1944, he stepped into a world that was as beautiful as it was lethal. His initial base of operations was the Solomon Islands, centered around the legendary and blood-soaked soil of Guadalcanal. Officially, his orders from the Navy Department were clear. He was a civilian technical representative sent to observe the performance of Corsair aircraft in tropical conditions. However, Lindbergh had no intention of watching from the sidelines. To him, observation was a polite bureaucratic fiction. On May 21, 1944, the 42-year-old aviator climbed into the cockpit of an F-4U Corsair with Marine Fighting Squadron 222, VMF 222. He wasn't carrying a notebook, he was carrying a full load of ammunition. He flew his first true combat sortie, a high-stakes strafing run against the heavily fortified Japanese garrison at Rabaul. Lindbergh flew with his guns hot, diving through intense anti-aircraft fire to rake enemy targets. For the young Marine pilots, many of whom were half his age, seeing the lone eagle diving into the fray was a surreal experience. But Lindbergh wasn't there for the glory, he was there to find the limits of the machine. Solving the ensign killer. The Marine pilots were initially skeptical of this middle-aged celebrity, but that skepticism evaporated when Lindbergh began solving the technical nightmares that had been killing their comrades. At the time, the F-4U Corsair was a beast of a machine, powerful but notoriously difficult to handle, earning it the grim nickname the Ensign Killer due to its tendency to bounce or stall during carrier landings and heavy takeoffs. The Marines were struggling to increase their strike capability. They needed to carry more ordnance to destroy Japanese bunkers, but the Corsair was already considered overloaded by manufacturer's specifications. Taking off from short, mud-slicked island runways with a heavy bomb load was a recipe for a catastrophic stall. Lindbergh approached the problem not as a pilot, but as a physicist. He spent days meticulously analyzing power-to-weight ratios during the critical takeoff roll, torque effects of the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, weight distribution, and the precise center of gravity shifts. He demonstrated to the Marines that by using a specific combination of flap settings and a gradual, precise application of manifold pressure, they could safely take off with double the aircraft's rated bomb capacity. Under Lindbergh's guidance, pilots began lifting 2,000-pound loads off runways where they had previously struggled with 1,000. Takeoff accidents plummeted, and the Marines' ability to deliver heavy ordnance soared. Lindbergh had proven that the limits written in the manuals were merely suggestions for the uninitiated. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Southwest Pacific, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning was more than just a fighter, it was a lifeline. With its twin engines providing a safety net over thousands of miles of open ocean, it was the only aircraft the pilots truly trusted. Yet the P-38 had a fatal flaw that wasn't found in its airframe, but in its appetite. Even with massive external drop tanks, the Lightning's range was a constant source of fuel anxiety. Missions to distant Japanese strongholds like Palau or Halmahera pushed the aircraft to its absolute limit. Pilots lived in a state of perpetual calculation, glancing at their fuel gauges with more frequency than the horizon. A single tactical error, an unexpected dogfight, or a sudden tropical thunderstorm requiring a detour could mean the difference between landing on a jungle strip and ditching in a shark-infested sea. By mid-1944, many pilots were returning to base with their needles literally bouncing on the empty pin. The impossible range was a barrier that cost lives and limited the strategic reach of General MacArthur's advance. The first sortie, Blue 3. On the morning of June 27, 1944, MacDonald decided to see what the Colonel was made of. He invited Lindbergh to join a 4-ship strafing mission against Japanese targets on Jeffman Island. Lindbergh, the 42-year-old civilian, climbed into the cockpit and slotted into the formation as Blue 3, flying on the wing of Major Thomas Maguire, a man who would end the war as America's second-highest scoring ace. To the surprise of the veteran pilots, Lindbergh didn't just keep up, he flew with a surgical precision that suggested he had been born in the P-38. He navigated through intense anti-aircraft fire and raked enemy barges with his 20mm cannon. But the real shock came after the wheels touched the dirt at Hollandia. When the ground crews moved in to refuel the aircraft, they found a statistical anomaly. While McDonald and Maguire had landed with their tanks nearly dry, standard for a mission of that duration, Lindbergh's P-38 still had over 200 gallons of high-octane fuel sloshing in its tanks. At first, the crew chief suspected a faulty gauge or a mechanical error, but after the next mission, the results were the same. Lindbergh was returning with enough fuel to fly for another 2 hours, while the best pilots in the world were running on fumes. The meeting in the hut. McDonald knew this wasn't luck, it was a revolution. He called an emergency meeting in the group's recreation hall, a crude, sweltering, palm-thatched structure with a packed dirt floor. Under the flickering yellow light of a single unshaded bulb, the elite pilots of the 475th, men who lived and died by their mastery of the air, gathered to hear a lecture from a civilian. Lindbergh stood before them not as a celebrity, but as a technician. He began to explain his cruise control technique, and as he spoke, the atmosphere in the room shifted from curiosity to disbelief and finally to outright alarm. The heresy of over-square flight. Standard Army Air Corps doctrine, drummed into every pilot during hundreds of hours of flight school, was rigid. To protect the Allison V-1710 engines, pilots were taught to cruise at a high RPM, 2200 to 2400, with the fuel mixture set to auto-rich. This ensured the engines stayed cool and avoided the dreaded phenomenon of detonation. "It's dangerous," one pilot muttered. "You'll blow the cylinder heads right through the cowlings." The room erupted in skepticism. They were being asked to ignore their survival instincts and trust a 42-year-old civilian with the lives of their engines? But Lindbergh was unmoved. He explained the physics. By reducing the RPM, they were reducing the number of friction-inducing cycles the engine performed. By increasing the pressure and leaning the fuel, they were ensuring a more complete, efficient combustion. The engines weren't overheating. Lindbergh's own gauges proved they were actually running cooler. Irrefutable evidence. The skepticism was palpable until McDonald stepped in. He pointed out that Lindbergh's aircraft was sitting on the tarmac right now, its engines in perfect condition, with twice the fuel reserve of anyone else. Lindbergh promised them that these settings would extend their combat radius by nearly 400 miles, allowing for 9-hour missions that were previously considered impossible. The Satan's Angels were faced with a choice: stick to the manual and stay tethered to their bases, or trust the man who had mastered the Atlantic and learned to fly farther than any fighter pilot in history. The over-square revolution had begun, and the geography of the Pacific War was about to shrink. Lieutenant Colonel Charles McDonald was a man defined by operational pragmatism. He didn't care for civilian accolades or political reputations. He cared about the survival of his pilots and the destruction of the enemy. While the lecture in the recreation hall had been met with a wall of skepticism, McDonald saw the potential for a strategic miracle. He decided that Satan's Angels would not just listen to Lindbergh, they would put his theories to the ultimate test in the unforgiving skies of New Guinea. Over the following week, a small group of senior pilots began a series of cautious, controlled experiments. They took to the air with the trepidation of men handling live explosives. Every time they pulled the throttles back and adjusted the mixture to Lindbergh's heretical settings, they expected the worst. They braced for the violent shudder of a failing engine, the plume of black smoke, and the catastrophic loss of power that military flight manuals had promised would follow. The sound of change. The first thing that struck the pilots was the sensory shift. For hundreds of hours, they had lived within the familiar high-pitched roar of the Allison V1710 engines, a screaming mechanical symphony that signaled power and safety. But as they dialed the RPM down to 1600 and pushed the manifold pressure to 31 inches, the sound changed entirely. The scream vanished, replaced by a low, heavy, and guttural thrum. It was a baritone vibration that felt less like a fighter jet and more like a heavy industrial pump or a freight train. To the ears of a trained combat pilot, it sounded like the engines were laboring, struggling to stay alive under a crushing load. In their gut, every instinct told them to push the RPM back up to save the engine. But the cold truth of the gauges. As the minutes turned into hours, the anticipated disaster never materialized. The pilots began to obsessively monitor their instrument panels, looking for the telltale signs of detonation. They expected the cylinder head temperature needles to sweep into the red, indicating that the fuel was exploding prematurely and melting the pistons. Instead, they saw something that defied their training. The CHT gauges didn't just stay steady, they actually dropped. By running at a lower RPM with a leaner mixture, the engine was cycling fewer times per minute, reducing internal friction. The increased manifold pressure was being converted efficiently into torque rather than wasted heat. The engines weren't dying, they were breathing more deeply and running more efficiently than they ever had at high RPM. The impossible was happening. The engines were operating in a state of cool, calm, and massive mechanical advantage. By the end of the week, the data was irrefutable. The ground crews, who had been meticulously measuring the fuel remaining after each test flight, presented McDonald with a set of numbers that fundamentally rewrote the tactical map of the Pacific. The transformation was nothing short of revolutionary. The old standard, a P-38 Lightning, even with drop tanks, had a reliable combat radius of approximately 570 miles. This limited them to targets within a specific strike zone, beyond which the mission became a one-way trip. The Lindbergh standard, using the new cruise control settings, that radius exploded to 750 miles and in some cases pushed past 800 miles. Endurance, total mission time previously capped at a grueling 7 hours, could now be extended to 9 or even 10 hours of flight time. This wasn't just a minor technical tweak. The P-38's effective reach had been extended by roughly 30% overnight. In a theater defined by the tyranny of distance, this 30% was a strategic earthquake. Japanese airbases and supply hubs that had previously enjoyed immunity from American fighter escorts were suddenly within range of fighters they thought were hundreds of miles away. The impossible had become the new standard operating procedure. Targets like Palau, Halmahera, and eventually the Philippines were no longer distant dreams. They were now on the flight plan. Lindbergh had given the Satan's angels a longer sword, and they were ready to use it. By the midsummer of 1944, the atmosphere at Hollandia Air Base had shifted. The initial skepticism that greeted the Lone Eagle had been replaced by a deep, unspoken professional respect. Charles Lindbergh was no longer viewed as a visiting dignitary or a political exile. He had become, in every sense that mattered, a member of the 475th Fighter Group. He ate in their mess halls, slept on their dirt-floored cots, and most importantly, he shared the terrifying risks of their daily missions. Because of his civilian status, he held no military rank, yet his presence was so towering that the pilots felt Colonel was too formal and Charles was too familiar. They settled on a call sign that carried a unique weight of its own, Mr. Lindbergh. When that name crackled over the radio nets of the South Pacific, everyone from the wing commanders to the ground crews listened. July 28, 1944, the mission to Suram. The morning of July 28th brought a high-priority assignment. The Satan's Angels were tasked with providing top cover escort for a bomber strike targeting Japanese positions near El Puti Bay on the island of Suram. Lindbergh was flying in a four-ship flight with the 433rd Squadron, slotted as Blue 3, the wingman position, a role that required intense concentration and formation discipline. As the flight cruised over the shimmering waters of the bay, the radio erupted with a tally-ho. 2 Japanese aircraft had been spotted low against the jungle canopy. They were Mitsubishi K-51s, known to the Allies by the codename Sonia. These were fixed-gear, single-engine light bombers used for reconnaissance and ground attack. While they were far slower than the P-38, they were notoriously maneuverable, a low and slow target that could be a deadly trap for a high-speed fighter. The duel with Captain Shimada. What the American pilots didn't know was that the lead Sonia was piloted by Captain Saburo Shimada, the commanding officer of the 73rd Independent Flying Chutai. Shimada was no novice. He was a veteran of the skies who understood exactly how to exploit the P-38's weaknesses. As the Lightnings dove to intercept, the dogfight turned into a chaotic, swirling mess. The P-38 was a heavy, twin-engine beast designed for high-speed energy tactics. It was never meant to turn and burn with a light Japanese plane. Shimada used his lower stall speed to execute violent, tight-radius turns, causing the American pilots to overshoot their targets. For nearly 30 minutes, Shimada outmaneuvered multiple P-38s, racking his Sonia through maximum rate turns that sent condensation streaming from his wingtips. The head-on pass. Seeing that his flight was struggling to get a lead on the elusive Japanese pilot, Lindbergh decided to break the stalemate. In a move of incredible daring, or perhaps calculated desperation, Lindbergh positioned his P-38 for the most dangerous maneuver in aerial combat, a head-on pass. Captain Shimada saw the twin-boom fighter banking toward him and accepted the challenge. The 2 aircraft began a chicken run, charging directly at each other with a closing speed of nearly 500 miles per hour, about 223 meters per second. For Lindbergh, a man who had spent his life advocating for peace before the war, the world suddenly narrowed to the illuminated ring of his gun sight. Unlike most fighters of the era, the P-38's armament was not spread across the wings. It was concentrated entirely in the nose. This meant Lindbergh didn't have to worry about convergence distances. His fire was a concentrated stream of lead and high explosives. As the Sonia filled his windshield, Lindbergh squeezed the trigger. For 6 agonizing seconds, the nose of his P-38 erupted. 4 .50 caliber machine guns spat a wall of lead. 1 20mm Hispano cannon fired explosive shells into the Sonia's path. The impact was devastating. Lindbergh watched as his shells raked the Japanese radial engine and cockpit. The Japanese aircraft's propeller visibly slowed, and a thick plume of oily black smoke began to trail behind it. At the absolute last microsecond, Lindbergh pulled up violently, his P-38 clearing the damaged Sonia by only a few feet. He felt the wash of the enemy slipstream as he climbed back into the blue. The unrecorded victory. The Sonia didn't explode instantly. Instead, it entered a steep terminal dive. The pilots of Blue Flight watched as Captain Shimada's plane struck the surface of the ocean at high speed, disappearing into a fountain of white spray. The waves quickly smoothed over, leaving no trace of the veteran captain or his observer. Back at Hollandia, the mood during the debriefing was somber and complex. Lindbergh had scored his first and only aerial victory. By every rule of combat, he was an ace in the making. But there was a massive legal and political problem. Lindbergh was a civilian. Under the strict interpretations of the Geneva Convention, a civilian engaging in combat is considered an unlawful combatant. If the Japanese government found out the famous Charles Lindbergh was killing their officers, the diplomatic and propaganda fallout would be catastrophic. Furthermore, if Lindbergh were shot down and captured, he could be executed as a spy rather than treated as a prisoner of war. Colonel MacDonald and the man of the 475th Group came to a silent agreement. Lindbergh's kill would never be entered into the official war record. There would be no formal kill marking painted on his fuselage. It became a gentleman's secret, a pact shared among the Satan's angels to protect the man who had taught them how to fly farther than they ever thought possible. To the official history of the U.S. Army Air Forces, that Sonia was listed as a group credit or simply left off the books. But in the hearts of the 475th, Mr. Lindbergh was a combat pilot who had stood his ground in the deadliest game of chicken in the world. The high of Lindbergh's victory over the Sonia was short-lived, eclipsed by the cold, hard reality of the air war. Combat is a realm governed by physics and skill, but it is also a place where luck is a finite resource. On August 1, 1944, just 3 days after his unrecorded kill, Charles Lindbergh's luck nearly ran out. During a fighter sweep to the Palau Islands, Lindbergh found himself separated from the main formation during a swirling dogfight with Japanese A-6M Zeros. The Zero was the antithesis of the P-38, light, nimble, and capable of turning on a dime. In the heat of the engagement, Lindbergh was lured into a low-speed turning fight, the one place a P-38 should never be. A Japanese pilot quickly maneuvered onto Lindbergh's 6 o'clock position, closing in for a lethal burst of 20mm cannon fire. Lindbergh was seconds away from becoming a casualty of war, or perhaps worse for the American government, a high-value prisoner of the Japanese Empire. Only the sharp eyes and instinctive reaction of Colonel MacDonald saved him. MacDonald spotted the threat, screaming over the radio, "Break right! Mr. Lindbergh, break right!" MacDonald dove his own lightning into the path of the Zero, forcing the Japanese pilot to break away. The decision of command. The close call sent a shock wave through the 5th Air Force headquarters. The military command realized they were playing a precarious game. Lindbergh had already proven his theories, revolutionized their operations, and even survived a head-on duel. But the political cost of losing him, the man who was a living symbol of American aviation, was a risk they could no longer justify. If Lindbergh were killed, it would be a tragedy. If he were captured, it would be a propaganda nightmare of global proportions. The order came down from the top. It was time for the Lone Eagle to go home. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh stood on the dirt runway at Hollandia to say his goodbyes. He had spent 6 weeks in the theater, flying a staggering 50 combat missions, roughly 25 of them in the P-38. To put that in perspective, many frontline pilots were rotated home after 50 missions. Lindbergh had done it as a 42-year-old civilian, under the constant shadow of political exile, proving his courage to the only men whose opinions he still valued, the pilots of the 475th. A strategic tectonic shift. Lindbergh left New Guinea, but his methods stayed behind. What had begun as a localized experiment in the 475th spread like wildfire through the Pacific. By October 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control settings, low RPM, high manifold pressure, and lean mixture were incorporated into the official operating doctrine of the U.S. Army Air Forces. The impact of this shift was not merely tactical, it was strategic. In the Pacific, the tyrant of distance was the primary obstacle to victory. General Douglas MacArthur's strategy of island hopping or leapfrogging relied entirely on air superiority. Before Lindbergh, the U.S. had to capture every island in a chain to provide air cover for the next jump. With the Lindbergh method, the P-38's range effectively doubled. This allowed the Americans to bypass heavily defended strongholds. Massive Japanese garrisons like the 100,000-man base at Rabaul were simply ignored. P-38s could now fly around them to support landings further ahead. Starve the enemy. Japanese bases that were bypassed were left to wither on the vine, cut off from supplies because American fighters now had the range to interdict every ship and plane attempting to reach them. The liberation of the Philippines. When the invasion of Leyte began, P-38s were able to provide fighter cover from bases in New Guinea and Mauritania, distances that were physically impossible just months earlier. The silent victory. By the time the war ended, the P-38 Lightning was the most successful fighter in the Pacific, accounting for more Japanese aircraft destroyed than any other American plane. The two highest-scoring aces in U.S. history, Richard Bong and Thomas McGuire, both achieved their victories in the P-38. But behind those headlines was the quiet legacy of a civilian consultant. Lindbergh didn't design the engines and he didn't build the airframes. Instead, he unlocked the potential that was already there, hidden in the mathematics of the machine. He taught a generation of pilots to trust their instruments over their instincts and to understand that a gallon of fuel was as powerful as a 500-pound bomb if managed with precision. Charles Lindbergh's Pacific service remains a unique chapter in military history. He arrived as a controversial outcast and left as a teacher who had given the American military a longer sword. He had turned a 570-mile radius into a 750-mile reach, changing the very geography of the war and bringing thousands of pilots home who otherwise would have run out of sky.
When the guns finally fell silent across the Pacific in August 1945, the world began the long process of tallying the cost of victory and lionizing its heroes. Names like Bong, McGuire, and McDonald were etched into the annals of military history, their chests adorned with medals and their planes preserved in museums. But among the official records of the great air commanders and the legendary aces, the name of Charles Lindbergh remained a ghost, a civilian consultant whose name appeared in technical reports but was conspicuously absent from the lists of combat citations. Yet, for the men of the 475th Fighter Group and the thousands of P-38 pilots who survived the tyranny of distance, Lindbergh's contribution was more valuable than any medal. He had given them the one thing more precious than ammunition, the gift of distance. The quiet return. After his departure from Hollandia, Lindbergh returned to an America that was still deeply conflicted about his legacy. He continued to serve the war effort in the shadows, evaluating captured Japanese aircraft and consulting on the next generation of jet fighters. As the years passed, the public's memory of his pre-war political stances began to soften, overshadowed by the sheer magnitude of his 1927 achievement. But Lindbergh himself rarely spoke of his weeks in New Guinea. He didn't seek the ace status he had technically earned over El Pudi Bay, nor did he lobby for the restoration of his military commission. He was content to let the mathematics of his success speak for itself. The final flight. On August 26, 1974, the Lone Eagle took his final flight. Suffering from terminal lymphoma, Lindbergh chose to spend his final days not in a sterile hospital in New York, but in the remote, rugged beauty of Kipahulu, Maui. He directed his own funeral with the same meticulous precision he once used to manage fuel consumption over the Atlantic. He was buried in a simple, handmade coffin of eucalyptus wood, constructed by local Hawaiian ranch hands. His grave was not a grand monument of marble, but a simple plot lined with lava rock and black beach pebbles, located in the yard of the Palapala Ho'omau Church. Upon his headstone, he chose an inscription from Psalm 139, a verse that encapsulated his life's journey from the heights of the morning sky to the deepest reaches of the Pacific. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. The marriage of math and courage. History will forever remember Charles Lindbergh for those 33 hours in 1927, a feat of individual bravery that shrunk the world. But his true legacy in the Pacific was something far more sophisticated. He proved to a generation of warriors that an aircraft's limits are not hard boundaries etched in a manufacturer's manual. They are fluid frontiers found in the marriage of mathematics and courage.
By applying the cold, hard logic of fuel-to-air ratios and manifold pressure to the heated, chaotic reality of combat, he unlocked the true potential of American air power. He taught pilots to trust logic over instinct. He taught commanders to see efficiency as a weapon. He turned a 7-hour flight into a 10-hour strategic reach. He had arrived at Hollandia as a controversial observer, a man seeking a path back to the skies he loved. He left as a teacher who had revolutionized the air war. In just 6 weeks, he changed the course of the Pacific campaign, not by bringing more planes, but by teaching the pilots how to use the planes they already had. Charles Lindbergh showed the world that the impossible is often just a calculation waiting to be solved. For the pilots of Satan's angels, he was more than a celebrity. He was the man who showed them that the horizon was further than they thought, and that with the right understanding, they could always find their way home.